If two college students hand in identical term papers, complete with, the same microscopic grammatical typos and the exact same awkward phrasing, the professor assumes they cheated. It's a closed case.
Oh, absolutely.
But what if two ancient texts share the identical microscopic grammatical quirks hundreds of times over? Yet the prevailing wisdom of modern scholarship insists those authors never copied each other. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we're looking at a textual crime scene.
A very complex one, yeah.
Right. We are evaluating a gospel parallel chart, translated by Zeba A. Crook, which lays out the famous feeding of the 5,000 from Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 9, and John 6. And alongside that, we have an academic study guide detailing the synoptic problem.
Which is a huge topic.
It is. Our mission today is to look at how tiny, almost invisible word choices in this one specific narrative threaten to dismantle the most widely accepted academic theory about how the New Testament was compiled.
The premise you just laid out regarding the college students hits at the very core of textual criticism. When we analyze ancient documents, especially the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we are constantly measuring literary dependence.
Figuring out who copied whom.
Precisely. If two writers describe an event using the same vocabulary in the same sequence, we have to determine who copied whom, or, if they both copied a third, lost document. And the feeding of the 5,000 is the perfect laboratory for this because it's one of the few events recorded in all four Gospels. It gives us a massive amount of comparative data.
And you listening right now probably know the basic Sunday school version of the loaves and fishes. A massive crowd, a little boy's lunch, Jesus blesses it, everyone eats, 12 baskets left over.
Right, the classic narrative.
Yeah, but we aren't going to spend time rehashing the basics. We're treating this as an investigation into forensic linguistics. To do that, we have to establish the disparities in the raw data. When we put these four accounts side by side, the variations start leaving breadcrumbs.
They really do. Where do you want to start?
Let's look at the location first. Matthew and Mark state Jesus withdrew to a deserted place. But Luke gets highly specific. He claims Jesus withdrew to a city called Bethsaida.
And that geographical distinction creates an immediate tension for harmonization. I mean, a deserted place implies wilderness away from human infrastructure, which fits the narrative requirement that the people have no way to buy food.
Right, because if they're in a city, they can just go to a market.
Yeah, exactly. Bethsaida was a bustling fishing village on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, located in the territory of Philip the Tetrarch. If they are in a city, the crisis of the crowd going hungry makes less logistical sense.
So how do scholars handle that?
Well, they often reconcile this by suggesting Luke means the rural environs or surrounding jurisdictions of Bethsaida, but linguistically, Luke uses the Greek word for city, polis. Then John introduces a completely different topographical marker. John states Jesus went up on a mountain.
John also throws in a chronological marker, which is fascinating. He mentions the Passover, the Feast of the Judeans, was near.
Which changes everything about the crowd.
Yeah. If Passover is approaching, the roads would be packed with pilgrims heading toward Jerusalem. This changes the demographic makeup. They might not just be locals, we could be travelers, which brings up the motivation of this crowd. Mark's account paints a frantic picture. He says the people saw Jesus and the disciples leaving in a boat, recognized them, and literally ran together on foot from all the cities.
Beating the boat to the shoreline. It's a vivid, chaotic scene in Mark. You have this foot race against a sailing vessel along the perimeter of the lake.
It's very action-packed.
It is. But John provides a different theological and, I guess, psychological motivation. John states the great crowd was following Jesus because they were continually catching sight of the signs he was doing upon the ill.
So it's less about a foot race and more about a spectacle.
Yeah, the verb tense John uses indicates an ongoing action. They were watching a continuous stream of miraculous healings which produced a trailing crowd.
Okay, so the crowd arrives. We have thousands of people crowding the area. The reaction of Jesus is where I notice a massive divergence between the synoptic writers, and I really want to look closely at the verbs they choose here.
The verbs are key.
Yeah. Matthew says Jesus saw the crowd, had pity on them, and he healed their sick. Mark also records the pity, but notes Jesus had pity because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Matthew chooses healing, Mark chooses teaching.
And this specific divergence regarding the primary action of Jesus will become a major piece of evidence when we evaluate the academic theories later. It reflects the theological priorities of the authors.
So?
Well, Mark often highlights Jesus as the authoritative teacher ushering in the kingdom through his word. Matthew, while certainly pointing out Christ's teaching, frequently groups his miracles to demonstrate Christ's messianic authority over disease and the natural order.
What about Luke?
Luke actually attempts to capture both elements. He states Jesus welcomed them, talked to them concerning the kingdom of God, and cured those who needed healing.
That makes sense. Let's look at the logistics of the meal itself. All 4 accounts agree on the inventory, 5 loaves and 2 fish. John includes the detail that these were barley loaves provided by a little boy.
Barley being the cheapest grain available.
Right, considered the food of the poor or even livestock. It really underscores the meager nature of the provision. Mark and John both include a financial calculation by the disciples too. They ask if they should go buy bread worth 200 denarii.
To put that into economic context, a single denarius was the standard daily wage for a Roman agricultural laborer. So 200 denarii represents roughly 8 months of continuous, unbroken labor.
That's a massive amount of money to spend on a single meal for strangers.
The disciples are pointing out the sheer absurdity of the situation. I mean, even if they had that much currency in their money bag, liquidating it to feed a random crowd of pilgrims for a single afternoon would be financially ruinous.
Then we have the seating arrangements. Jesus commands the crowd to sit. Mark's gospel uses highly descriptive, almost poetic language. He says Jesus ordered them to sit down party by party on the green grass, and they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s.
Yeah, Luke mentions sections of about 50, and John just notes there was much grass in the place.
Why does Mark use that specific phrase, party by party?
The Greek phrasing Mark uses there is symposia. It evokes the imagery of a formal Greco-Roman banquet, a symposium. It's a striking contrast, a formal banquet setting taking place on the bare ground of a wilderness.
That's a great detail.
And the mention of the green grass also ties back to John's chronological marker of Passover. Passover occurs in the spring, which is the only brief window of time when the Galilean hillsides are actually lush and green before the scorching summer sun turns everything brown. It's an authentic eyewitness detail.
Wow, okay. The aftermath is consistent across the board. 12 baskets of fragments are gathered. But Matthew adds a demographic census that alters the scale. He says there were about 5,000 men, not including women and children.
Which turns a large crowd of 5,000 into a massive gathering of potentially 15 or 20,000 people.
It's like 4 different news cameras capturing the same event from different angles. One camera focuses on the green grass, another zooms in on the barley loaves, another is looking at the healing versus the teaching. When we see all these overlapping yet distinct details, how do scholars begin to piece together the literary relationship between these writers?
That's the perfect transition. We've established the contours of the textual variations. The theological content is dense, but our focus must now shift to the mechanical construction of these texts. The question scholars ask is not just what happened, but how these specific Greek words ended up on these specific scrolls.
And to answer that, we have to look at the synoptic problem. For you listening, the word synoptic means seen together. When you place Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side in a parallel alignment, you see massive structural similarity.
Right, unlike John, who is the outlier with his own distinct timeline and vocabulary.
Yeah, Matthew, Mark, and Luke outline the ministry of Jesus in the same general sequence, and they often use identical Greek vocabulary to describe the exact same events. The material shared by all 3 is categorized as the triple tradition.
And the sheer volume of verbatim agreement in the triple tradition makes it a statistical impossibility that these 3 authors wrote their accounts entirely from memory without any written sources connecting them.
Because human memory doesn't produce identical paragraphs of Greek syntax across separate continents.
Exactly. There is a direct literary relationship. Someone copied someone else, or they were all working from a shared master document. Determining the direction of that copying is the synoptic problem.
The prevailing solution in modern scholarship, the paradigm that is taught in almost every university and seminary today, is the two-document hypothesis, often abbreviated as the 2DH. I want to define the core assertions of this theory, because understanding its rules is necessary before we can see how the feeding of the 5,000 breaks them.
The first pillar of the two-document hypothesis is Markan priority. This is the assertion that the Gospel of Mark was the first to be written.
What's the rationale for that?
It's quite logical, actually. Mark is the shortest gospel. It lacks the infancy narratives, the Sermon on the Mount, and many of the major parables. Plus, the Greek grammar in Mark is notoriously unpolished and rough compared to the refined literary style of Luke or the structured liturgical style of Matthew.
So it makes sense that later authors would clean it up.
Proponents of mark and priority argue exactly that. It makes sense for later authors to expand on a short text and polish its rough grammar. It makes far less sense for an author to take a polished, comprehensive text like Matthew or Luke, chop out all the best teachings, and rewrite it with worse grammar.
If we assume Mark is the baseline, the theory suggests that the authors of Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark sitting on their desks, using it as their primary narrative spine. But as you mentioned, Matthew and Luke share a large amount of material with each other that is completely absent from Mark.
Things like the Lord's Prayer, the temptation in the wilderness.
Right. To account for this, the 2DH introduces a second hypothetical document called Q.
The term Q comes from the German word Quell, which translates to source. 19th century German scholars hypothesized that Q was a sayings document, a collection of the teachings of Jesus circulating in the early church.
So under the two-document hypothesis, Matthew and Luke are essentially building a house using two main suppliers. Mark provides the narrative bricks, and Q provides the teaching mortar.
That's a good way to put it.
But here is the absolute load-bearing requirement of the entire two-document hypothesis. For this theory to work, it demands that Matthew and Luke wrote entirely independently of one another. Matthew never read Luke. Luke never read Matthew.
That requirement of strict independence is non-negotiable for the 2DH. The moment you suggest Luke read Matthew, the necessity of the hypothetical Q document vanishes.
Because if Luke has Matthew's text, he can just copy the Sermon on the Mount directly from Matthew. He doesn't need a lost German saying source to explain the shared material.
Q only exists to explain how two men who never met could write the exact same thing.
And this is where I want to push back logically on behalf of the listener. If two students are summarizing the same textbook for a history assignment, and they are doing it in their own dorm rooms without ever speaking to each other, they might both hit the same historical facts.
Right, they both note the same dates and events.
Yeah, they might both write that George Washington crossed the Delaware. But they absolutely should not accidentally make the precise same grammatical corrections to the textbook's awkward phrasing. They shouldn't both independently decide to delete the exact same adjective or independently decide to swap the exact same pronoun for a specific noun.
Your analogy highlights the exact vulnerability of the theory. If Matthew and Luke truly operated in isolation, as the 2DH demands, we should rarely see them agreeing with each other against Mark in passages where all three are telling the same story.
Because they'd be making different editorial choices.
Yeah. If Mark is the source text, their versions should either match Mark's wording or they should diverge from Mark in completely different, highly individualized ways.
Like if Mark says, the sky was blue, Matthew might change it to the sky was navy, and Luke might change it to the sky was azure.
Right. But they should not both independently decide to change it to the sky was cerulean. If a professor saw two independent papers making identical, unprompted linguistic tweaks that were absent from the source material, the professor would cry plagiarism.
Yet, when we look at the Greek text of the feeding of the 5,000, we find a massive list of what scholars call minor agreements. These are the anomalies. These are the places where Matthew and Luke mysteriously agree against their supposed source material, Mark.
And universal acceptance of the hypothetical Q source is undermined most heavily by these minor agreements. A minor agreement occurs in a triple tradition passage when Matthew and Luke share identical wording or grammatical structures that are absent from Mark, and this single narrative of the 5,000 is packed with them.
Let's walk through this textual crime scene point by point. Let's look at the positive agreements first, places where they both add something. At the very beginning of the narrative, the crowds find Jesus. Mark 6.33 simply says the crowd ran together and preceded the disciples. But Matthew 14.13 and Luke 9.11 both add the identical Greek phrase, followed him.
The Greek verb used is akoloutheo. Mark does not have it here. Both Matthew and Luke independently decide that the narrative needs this specific verb to describe the crowd's action, and they insert it in the exact same location in the story.
That's agreement number one. Then I was looking at the verse where evening approaches, and the disciples suggest sending the people away. Mark 6.35 starts the sentence with the conjunction and, but both Matthew 14.15 and Luke 9.12 swap Mark's and for so.
It seems trivial in English, but it relates to Mark's grammatical style. The Greek text of Mark is heavily paratactic. Parataxis is a literary style that strings short, simple sentences together using coordinating conjunctions. Mark uses the Greek word kai, meaning and, relentlessly, and he went, and he saw, and he said.
It feels very colloquial, almost breathless.
Very much so. A refined Greek writer prefers hypotaxis, using subordinate clauses and varied conjunctions for a smoother flow. It makes sense that later authors would want to fix Mark's repetitive and.
But the issue is that they both fix it the same way.
Yeah, what defies the probability of the 2DH is that Matthew and Luke smooth it out by choosing the same alternative conjunction at the exact same juncture.
It doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
In that very same sentence, Mark has the disciples say, release them, using a pronoun. Both Matthew and Luke look at that pronoun and independently decide to change it to a noun. Matthew writes, release the crowds, and Luke writes, release the crowd.
They both perceive Mark's pronoun as slightly ambiguous and decide to clarify the object of the sentence. Again, clarifying a pronoun is a standard editorial move. Clarifying it with the exact same noun root simultaneously is highly suspicious.
We see the conjunction swap again just 2 verses later. The disciples push back on feeding the people. Mark 6.37 starts with, and they say to him. Both Matthew and Luke change that opening to so. Then in the next verse, Jesus asks what food they have. Mark 6.38 uses the present tense. He says to them. Matthew and Luke both shift the verb to the past tense. He said.
This tense shift is a classic example of correcting Markan style. Mark relies heavily on the historical present tense. He writes, he says, or he goes, to give the narrative a sense of immediate unfolding action. It's much like a live sports commentator. He passes the ball, he shoots. It brings the reader into the moment.
But technically, for a historical document, past narrative tenses like the aorist or imperfect are more appropriate, right?
Yes, and Matthew and Luke both convert Mark's historical present into the past tense.
They continue this pattern. When Jesus orders the people to sit down, Mark uses the pronoun again, saying he ordered them. Matthew replaces them with crowds, and Luke replaces it with crowd, and the agreements extend to the very end of the story. When gathering the leftovers, Mark 6.42 says they removed a fullness of 12 baskets from the fragments.
And how do Matthew and Luke change it?
Matthew and Luke both alter Mark's phrasing to introduce forms of the word exceeding, meaning what was left over, alongside the specific phrase of the fragments.
And the Greek construction they use is slightly clunky. Instead of a simple term for leftovers, they both arrive at a phrasing that translates roughly to the exceeding of the fragments. It's a highly specific grammatical choice to invent independently.
So those are just the positive additions and grammatical tweaks. But the study guide highlights a massive thematic agreement that goes far beyond syntax. It's the action agreement we touched on earlier.
Oh, the healing versus teaching.
Yes. When Jesus sees the crowd, Mark explicitly states that Jesus began to teach them many things. But Matthew and Luke drop the teaching entirely from that initial reaction. Matthew states he healed their unwells, and Luke states that those who had need of healing, he was curing.
This is a staggering alteration to make in isolation. Both Matthew and Luke ostensibly read Mark's gospel, saw that Jesus taught the crowd, and both decided to fundamentally shift the narrative action to healing instead.
It's hard to believe that's an accident.
If they are working independently, how do two authors look at a verb meaning to teach and simultaneously decide to replace it with a concept related to physical restoration?
And the agreements aren't just additions or substitutions, they're also simultaneous omissions, negative agreements. Matthew and Luke look at Mark's text and independently decide to delete the exact same details. In Mark 6.33, Mark claims the people followed Jesus because they understood or recognized the boat leaving. Both Matthew and Luke reject this specific motivation. They scrub it from their accounts.
They replace the motivation differently. Matthew notes they heard he left, Luke notes they knew, but the negative action of rejecting Mark's specific phrasing is identical. Furthermore, consider the seating arrangements.
The party-by-party phrasing.
Yeah, Mark uses a twofold repetition describing the crowd sitting party by party and group by group. Both Matthew and Luke evaluate this repetitive poetic phrasing, and they both decide to streamline it, completely eliminating Mark's redundancy.
If you're listening to this and thinking, okay, they changed an on to it also, and they both decided to say crowd instead of them, who cares? What does this matter? Well, it matters because there are not just a handful of these anomalies. Our source material notes there are many hundreds of these minor agreements scattered across the Synoptic Gospels.
Hundreds?
Yeah, the sheer volume shatters the statistical probability of independent coincidence.
Oh.
At some point, these minor agreements become a fatal problem for the two-document hypothesis.
Many critics of the 2DH argue that exact point. When the anomalies pile up into the hundreds, relying on the excuse of coincidence requires a massive leap of faith. The burden of proof shifts back to the defenders of the 2DH. They must explain how this mountain of identical edits occurred without Matthew and Luke ever seeing each other's work.
So I'll play devil's advocate for the 2D8 scholars. How do they salvage their theory? I imagine their first line of defense is simply doubling down on the poor quality of Mark's Greek. Like, Mark's grammar is so rough that any educated person would fix it the same way.
That is precisely their first defense. They argue for coincidental grammatical necessity. Because Mark's vocabulary is limited and his paratactic style is jarring to a trained ear, any competent Greek editor would instinctively make the same corrections.
So changing a jarring historical present tense to a smooth past tense is just standard editing.
Yeah, or clarifying an ambiguous pronoun with the obvious noun context. It's just basic editorial cleanup. It doesn't require collusion, it just requires a basic grasp of Greek grammar.
I can accept that defense for a dozen instances. Two separate editors might independently fix the same run-on sentence, but hundreds of times, including swapping the exact same specific nouns and complex prepositional phrases. That stretches credulity.
Recognizing the weakness of relying entirely on coincidence, 2DH defenders offer a second defense: redactional patterns.
What does that entail?
They analyze the broader stylistic habits of both Matthew and Luke. If a scholar can prove that Matthew naturally prefers the word crowd in all his writing, and Luke also naturally prefers the word crowd in his unique material, then it's not surprising that they both insert their preferred vocabulary into Mark's narrative independently.
So it's arguing that their independent stylistic habits just happen to perfectly align hundreds of times against their primary source document. Again, it feels like bending over backward to protect the theory of independence. Which brings us to the third defense. And honestly, this one is fascinating because it forces us to visualize how these ancient texts were actually transmitted.
Ah, the scribal alteration.
Yeah, they point to scribal alterations.
This defense moves the blame away from the original authors and places it on the men who preserved the texts. We aren't dealing with a digital file or a printing press. For the first 14 centuries of the church, every single copy of a gospel was written out by hand by a scribe or a monk.
Let's paint a picture of a 3rd century scriptorium for the listener. You have a scribe sitting at a desk, copying text from a papyrus scroll or a parchment codex onto a blank sheet. The Greek is written in scriptio continua, all capital letters, no punctuation, no spaces between words. It's incredibly visually taxing work.
It is exhausting labor. And these scribes were not just mindless copying machines. They were fully immersed in the texts. Many of them had large portions of the Gospels memorized. And in the early centuries of the church, the Gospel of Matthew was by far the most popular, most liturgical, and most widely circulated gospel. Its phrasing was the phrasing the church knew best.
So imagine a scribe is tasked with copying the Gospel of Luke. He gets to the story of the feeding of the 5,000. He is reading Luke's rough Greek, but his brain anticipates the polished phrasing he already has memorized from Matthew's version.
Right, because he's heard it in church 1,000 times.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. Without any malicious intent, he accidentally writes down Matthew's word followed him, or Matthew's transition, so, instead of what is actually in front of him in Luke's text.
This phenomenon is known as scribal harmonization. The mind naturally seeks to resolve dissonance. As scribes copied, they consciously or unconsciously smoothed out the differences between the synoptic accounts, making them read more uniformly. Over centuries of hand copying, these small harmonizations became embedded in the manuscript tradition.
So the defenders of the 2DH are arguing that the minor abatements we see today weren't actually in the original 1st century autographs of Matthew and Luke.
Correct. They argue they are artifacts created by later scribes cross-pollinating the texts.
It's an incredibly convenient defense because it's almost unfalsifiable. We don't have the original autographs. We only have the copies. By blaming the scribes, scholars can maintain that Luke originally wrote independently of Matthew, thus saving the two-document hypothesis and keeping the hypothetical Q document alive.
It's a robust defense, but for many textual critics, it requires too much speculation. If we reject the excuses, if we conclude the coincidences are too vast, the redactional habits too perfectly aligned, and the scribal harmonization theory too convenient, we are forced to look for an alternative paradigm.
And the study guide introduces the primary rival to the 2DH, the Griesbach hypothesis. If the 2DH is the reigning champion of academia, the Griesbach hypothesis is the challenger that threatens to upend the entire establishment. How does it resolve the minor agreements?
The Griesbach hypothesis resolves the problem by applying Occam's razor. It suggests that the minor agreements exist for a straightforward, logical reason. There's a direct literary relationship between Matthew and Luke. It proposes that the author of Luke possessed a copy of the Gospel of Matthew and used it as a primary source.
In this model, the chronological order changes entirely, right?
Completely. Matthew was written first, Luke was written second, utilizing Matthew, and Mark was written third, acting as a deliberate, condensed summary of both Matthew and Luke.
The implications of this are massive. If Luke had access to Matthew, the entire foundation of the two-document hypothesis crumbles. The hypothetical Q document is instantly rendered obsolete.
Right. We don't need an imaginary German sayings source to explain why Matthew and Luke share the Sermon on the Mount. Luke simply copied it from Matthew's scroll.
Under the Griesbach hypothesis, the minor agreements are no longer anomalies or problems. When Matthew and Luke agree against Mark in the feeding of the 5,000, it's simply because Luke is looking directly at Matthew's text and choosing to retain Matthew's specific grammar or vocabulary.
And Mark's absence of those words is explained by his role as a later summarizer who chose to omit them. The minor agreements shift from being the fatal flaw of a theory to being the primary supporting evidence for a different theory. It demonstrates how scientific and historical paradigms operate. Data that breaks one model perfectly verifies another.
Analyzing these microscopic linguistic details, the conjunctions, the tenses, the prepositions, brings up a fascinating aspect of our source material. The study guide provides literal English translations of the Greek in brackets. For anyone reading along, these literal brackets are jarring. They look like machine translation gone wrong.
Yeah, they don't read smoothly at all.
But they are necessary to show the true, messy reality of ancient idioms and vocabulary.
Modern English translations, like the ESV or the NIV, do an excellent job of smoothing out ancient Greek into readable English prose. But in doing so, they mask the raw linguistic data. When textual critics are searching for literary dependence, they cannot rely on English approximations. They must analyze the clunky, literal Greek syntax.
I want to highlight a few of these translation quirks because they illustrate the puzzle scholars are trying to solve. Let's look at Luke 9:12. The disciples are telling Jesus the situation is dire. In a standard English Bible, they say, send the crowd away so they can go into the surrounding villages and countryside and find lodging.
Very readable.
But the literal translation provided in the brackets is entirely different. It says, release the crowd in order, that having traveled into among villages and fields, they might demolish.
They might demolish. The Greek verb there is katalut. Literally, it means to unloose, to destroy, to dismantle, or to demolish.
The disciples are not asking Jesus to authorize a riot, obviously.
No. Idiomatically, in the ancient world, this verb was used to describe the act of unyoking horses from a chariot or taking down a traveler's tent at the end of a long day's journey. By logical extension, the idiom came to mean to stop for the night or to find a place to lodge.
Seeing the literal word demolish gives us a window into the cultural distance between us and the text. Translating idioms is notoriously difficult. If you try to translate the English idiom, it's raining cats and dogs, literally into French, a French reader is going to be incredibly confused about falling animals. The Greek authors had their own idioms, and scholars have to track how those idioms are handled across the synoptics.
Let's examine another one in Mark 6.39. English translations usually say something like, he ordered them to sit down in groups. The literal bracket gives us. And he presided over them to stretch out all parties.
Presided over them to stretch out. That's such a strange way to phrase sitting down.
Well, the Greek verb for reclining or stretching out is crucial here. In Greco-Roman and Jewish culture, formal meals were not eaten sitting upright in chairs. Diners reclined on couches or cushions, stretching out on their left side to eat with their right hand.
Ah, so the modern translation sit down actually loses the cultural posture.
Precisely. The literal Greek preserves the physical reality of thousands of people stretching out on the Galilean grass.
We see a similar issue in John 6.11. After Jesus gives thanks for the bread, standard translations say he distributed it to those who were seated. The literal bracket says he distributed it to the dinings.
The Greek word is anakimenoi, a participle referring to those who are reclining at a meal. Translating a participle as a noun phrase, the dinings, is awkward in English, but it accurately reflects the specific vocabulary John chose. And John goes on to say, Jesus distributed the food likewise and out of the cooked foods, with the bracket explaining that cooked foods means the fish.
This level of meticulous linguistic scrutiny is what the synoptic problem requires. Every single verb tense, every idiom, every preposition has to be weighed and analyzed across all three columns of a gospel parallel.
And that's why it's such a debated field. If Matthew clarifies an idiom and Luke clarifies it the exact same way, is that proof of copying or just two smart editors independently fixing a confusing phrase? That is the dividing line in synoptic scholarship. And it's a debate that has raged for over a century with no absolute consensus.
Let's summarize the ground we have covered today. We began by observing the raw data of a historical event, the feeding of the 5,000, through the lenses of 4 different authors. We noted the geographical variations between a deserted place, Bethsaida, and a mountain.
We contrasted the frantic running crowd in Mark with the sign-seeking crowd in John.
Yeah, and we observed the massive thematic shift between Mark's focus on Jesus teaching the flock and Matthew and Luke's focus on Jesus healing the sick. We established the baseline variations in the text.
And from there, we looked into the mechanics of how these texts might have been constructed.
Right. We introduced the dominant academic paradigm, the two-document hypothesis, which rests on the absolute independence of Matthew and Luke, relying on a hypothetical cue source to explain their shared material.
We then introduced the evidence that threatens that paradigm, the hundreds of minor agreements. We saw how Matthew and Luke repeatedly make identical grammatical adjustments, additions, and omissions against their supposed source material, Mark.
We evaluated the defenses, coincidence redactional habits, and scribal harmonization. And we looked at the Griesbach hypothesis, the alternative theory that suggests Luke simply read Matthew, eliminating the need for imaginary documents. It's a massive, ongoing literary detective story.
As we conclude our analysis of this material, I want to offer a final thought regarding the theory of scribal harmonization. Let's assume for a moment that the defenders of the two-document hypothesis are correct. Assume Matthew and Luke wrote in total isolation, and the hundreds of identical agreements we see today are the result of centuries of scribes intentionally or accidentally smoothing out the text.
The idea that scribes allowed their memory of Matthew to bleed into their copying of Luke.
Yes. If that historical reconstruction is accurate, it reveals something highly significant about the psychology of the early church. It suggests that the generations of Christians tasked with preserving these texts valued a unified, harmonized memory of Christ's life over preserving the quirky, independent grammatical variations of the original authors.
They were uncomfortable with the dissonance. They wanted the accounts to match perfectly.
It demonstrates a community striving for a single, unified voice. They sought a harmonized chorus, even if it meant unconsciously blending the individual melodies. It leaves anyone who studies ancient biblical manuscripts with a lingering, provocative question.
Which is?
When we read the Greek text today, how much of it is the distinct, unvarnished voice of the original first-century author, and how much is the collective, harmonized memory of the generations of believers that followed?
That is something to dwell on. How much of the polished narrative is original, and how much is the result of centuries of faithful yet human scribes smoothing out the rough edges? Thank you for joining us on this investigation into forensic linguistics. Keep reading closely, keep looking at the raw data, and keep asking big questions about the smallest details.